Hi, welcome. Uh, so exciting to have you here tonight talking about what is to me a very special region. I've spent some time in the Rheingau. I have many friends there. Really is an important place to me. I've worked harvest in the Rheingau. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about this region first during our German Spotlight series that we'll be doing during the month of March. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll try to answer those or possibly answer them later on tomorrow if I don't have an answer for you tonight when we send out the recording tomorrow. So if you have to jump off early, or if you're not here right now, you have no idea I'm saying this, you'll be able to watch that at your own leisure. That's no problem at all. So we do typically, my name's Amber, if we haven't met before. We do typically like to do a little bit of the philosophy, oftentimes, of some of the regions that we're talking about. But I think that the philosophy sort of speaks for and answers itself as we go through the history, some of the culture of Germany as well. And we have a lot to talk about when it comes to the history and the wine law. Today, I really have a tendency to get caught up in the minutiae, as many of you might know. Today, I really want to try to stay away from that because we have a lot to discuss in just 60 minutes. And there's a lot of changes happening in German wine law again. Here they are, they're at it again. They're again attempting to simplify a lot of the language that we do use. And I'm not sure if we're there yet. Maybe we can discuss that at the end of class or later on and keep the conversation going to see if they're succeeding in making it easier for the consumer to understand the quality of what's in the bottle, where the wine is coming from, and what we can expect in terms of both the level of complexity, of ripeness in flavors in the wine, and also sometimes the sweetness level of the wine itself as well. And we're talking primarily about Riesling, not just because we're talking about Germany, but because the Rheingau is Riesling focused. And I think it's such a great opportunity to discuss one grape through the lens of a region. And we do that in places like, of course, Burgundy in France. We talk about these two grapes through the lens of the terroir, but there's no other grape that is such a chameleon, that one can transmit the terroir so clearly, and that can also be made in such a range of styles, from dry to sweet to luscious to powerful to delicate, right? The same grape really can do it all. And I don't think I can really talk about another grape. I mean, there's certainly other grapes that have versatility like Chenin Blanc or things like that, but I really don't think there's another grape like Riesling that can so perfectly adapt itself to so many different styles. So the Rheingau, we'll get into in a moment. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but we're looking at a vineyard called Schlossberg, located on the kind of far western side of the village of Rudesheim. These are the steepest slopes that we really do see in the Rheingau. We don't have the intensely steep grades and slopes that we see in the Mosel. Most of this sort of long kind of south facing slope that we have, that is the Rheingau, the grade is pretty soft. It's a little bit more of a sloping uphill, gentle climb into the Taunus Mountains, and the forests that are at the top of the hill, they really protect these grapes from a lot of the more cold, more northern winds that might come down from the north. And then the river, as you can see here, the Rhine River, really helps moderate the climate. So it's a really unique climate that we do have within the Rheingau by comparison to other parts of Germany. This is Burg Ehrenfels, or Schloss Ehrenfels, so an older castle that sits majestically in the vineyards of Schlossberg. It's a pretty cool thing. So we have two wines that you might have ordered through our partners at Ledoux's. I want to talk about these first so that you have the opportunity to taste them during the class. Feel free, I always like to say, you can open both of them, you can open neither of them and save them for another time, you can open just one. But these are really, I think, two fantastic examples of wine to open from the Rheingau, because you have two wines that are both high quality producers, one of who is a really young, fresh producer who just started her own winery in 2007, and the other whose winery was established at the end of the 1800s by his grandfather. But you can really see the quality of these two wines, but then also the differing nomenclature that we do have on the label that tells us a little bit about what we have in these bottles. So we'll start with the top. This is Hans Joseph Becker. He's affectionately known as Hayo by all of his friends and everybody who knows him. He is the grandson of John Baptiste Becker, who was a former cooper, who established the estate in 1893. It's not discussed as often, but they've been organic since their inception. So they're not really the type of winery that touts themselves as an organic winery, and neither is Eva Fricke, but they are organic. So if that's something that matters to you in what you're drinking, and also considering the vineyards and how they're treated, that would probably be of some importance. He attended Geisenheim University, as did Eva Fricke below him, who also worked for Hayo for a time as well, where he earned his degree in enology. But he was really interested in the estates of the past in the Rheingau, and he went to Geisenheim in the 60s. And in the 60s, you know, there may have been a little bit of that kind of cookie cutter mold of winemaking that was coming out of Germany at the time. I mean, when we think of a lot of German products, I always consider that the Germans, they really value specific technical precise measurements in anything that they make, right? And wine is really no exception. But Hayo really wanted to look toward the past estates, and prior, especially in the Rheingau, and we'll discuss this quite a bit over the next hour, the Rheingau was a really traditionally focused primarily on dry styles of Riesling. And post World War II is in Germany when we really begin to see that increase of making these sweeter styles of wine that were marketed globally. Now, if you go to Germany today, almost all of the Riesling that you will drink there will be of a dry style. There are some producers that say that if it weren't for the global market, it wouldn't even be worth it for German producers to make sweet wine today, because that's just not what they drink in the country. A lot of the sweeter styles of wine are exported to England and the United States, which is really interesting. So prior to World War II, a lot of these wine styles really were on the drier side, aside from these much sweeter, more luscious dessert, specifically and purposefully dessert style wines, right? So Hayo really makes these very singular, very honest, sometimes bordering on austere styles of Riesling. He does make some off-dry styles when the vintage and the weather permits it. But these are wines that will usually be quite dry. They were powerful. They tend to be stony and herbal and mineral, extremely bold. And I want to just take a moment. We have actually a label of one of these wines a little bit later on, but I think we can just sort of look at the description of the wine here. So we have the winemaker, J.B. Becker. We have Wallufer Walkenberg. So this is telling us that the vineyard is Walkenberg, coming from the village of Wallufer, which is located on the eastern side of the Rheingau. The grape is Riesling. We usually see that on a bottle of wine coming from Germany, unless it's kind of a blend. And this is really important too. So Spätlese, Trocken. You're not going to see this on all labels of wine, but keep this conjunctive labeling term in mind. So essentially what they're telling us is that the grapes were picked at what is called a Spätlese level of ripeness, but the wine is fermented to total dryness. So you will have a ripe, powerful flavor with a dry style of wine. So keep that in mind. Trocken means dry in German. Spätlese essentially means late picked. So we'll continue on with that in a moment. The second wine we have is the Eva Fricke. This is also a dry style of Riesling. Even though this is just 1 year younger, 1 year fresher than the J.B. Becker, it is a much different style. So Eva Fricke started her own winery in 2007. She previously worked for Ohio at the J.B. Becker estate in Wallufer. And then she went on to work for another kind of a young and up and coming winemaker who has also taken his much older family estate and really modernized it and modernized his style of winemaking and Riesling as well. And his name is Johannes Leitz. So she worked for Leitz for 7 years, primarily in the vineyard before starting her own winery. She's also organic. She experiments with biodynamics. And this is a style of wine that just reads as Riesling Trocken. So it does say Rheingau on the label, which I probably should have put in the title here, but I was thinking we're drinking wine, we're talking about the Rheingau today, so we know it's Rheingau, but you will see specifically Rheingau on this label as well. So what they're telling you is that these grapes could come from any vineyard or village that's associated with the region of the Rheingau, and they do. It is a blend of different vineyards from different villages. The villages are Lorch, Altvia, Hattenheim, and Kiedrich. And her style is much fresher and lighter and a little bit more linear with fresher fruits than you necessarily find in the Becker style. She does sometimes create wines that do have a little bit of natural sugar to them as well and will be on the sweeter side, but she's letting us know that the Trocken style that we have here is dry. And she is a lovely, wonderful person. So I would suggest that if you go to the Rheingau, which is a wonderful place for a vacation, you can float the Rhine River. There's fantastic food. There's a bicycle path that essentially goes all along the river from Rudesheim to Wiesbaden that you can take a nice day trip, stop at different towns and wineries. It's a really fantastic place to visit. So we're going to talk about history today. I don't want to get too tied up into it, but I think understanding the deep history of Germany and their wines helps us look to the future and understand where we're going and why Germany does have the reputation for its wines that it does, which I think is not always in the best light, right? Sometimes I really like to ask people what they sort of think about when somebody said German wine or if somebody said Riesling, what are some of the first things that come to mind? And sometimes not all those things are favorable, and rightfully so. They earned that reputation, but what can we do? Why did they, what was the history that led them to earn that reputation? And how are they pushing past that reputation for the future, right? We'll talk about the geography and climate that ties into it too. We'll talk about the quality system. The quality system in Germany is different than any other major wine producing area in Europe, except for Austria. We'll talk within the Rheingau about the major villages and the vineyards that are associated with them and the producers. We're looking here from the chairlift. So there's a chairlift in the town of Ausmannhausen, where we're looking down at Ausmannhausen here on the not quite the really far western side of the Rheingau, but further to the west. It's known for the quality of its Pinot Noir. There's a chairlift that you can take up to the top of the Taunus Mountains, and you can walk through a forest all the way over to Rudesheim and take a chairlift back down, or you can hike down through the vineyards. If you are the type of person who loves to take strolls through vineyards, this is a wonderful area for you. It's very easy to walk through the vineyards. There's a lot of paved roads that the producers do drive on. Much like Burgundy, there's a lot of fractured ownership here. So within one vineyard, it's not uncommon for multiple producers to own a few rows, right? And so they'll come and take care of their rows of vines within these larger vineyards. And who are those producers? We'll talk about them. So we're in Germany. We're in the Rheingau. Most of the wine growing or the quality regions of Germany are in the south. We have two major exceptions, Saale-Unstrut and Sachsen, there were initially 11 Weinbaugebiete in Germany because this was part of Eastern Germany. So they became the 12th and 13th Weinbaugebiete when Germany was reunited in the early 90s. We're in this area, the Rheingau. The Rhine River is incredibly important to Germany, much like the Danube in Eastern Europe. The Rhine River is a road of commerce, and we'll talk about that with the history here. One of the things that you can't see on the map, but it's really fascinating about the Rhine, is that it more or less flows north from Switzerland into the North Sea. And as it flows into the North Sea, it's primarily north, except for this one bend where it flows west here at the Rheingau region. So that's why we have such a unique microclimate. So a little bit of the history, not to get too tied up, of course, as I usually do. You've seen my classes. I just love history. I think it's so fascinating. I could spend just days and days looking at this type of thing, because it really helps us understand how wine and grapes did move through the different countries of Europe. Romans founded the city of Trier, which is in the southern part of the Mosel in 16 BC. By the end of the 3rd century, the Romans had established viticulture throughout the Mosel. And this is the earliest evidence we do know of viticulture in Germany. They continued to move west into the Rheingau, east to the Rheingau, and introduced the vine here as well. But as with other areas in Europe, it was really the monastic eras, the churches who developed a lot of vineyards. They named many of these vineyards, which was really important. Wine growing was also of great importance to the culture of the monasteries as well. And they really, here in the Rheingau, they came to dominate this region. And the Rheingau is really quite small by comparison to some of the other German regions. I might just go back for 1 second, because it really is quite small. I mean, it's much smaller even than somewhere like the Mosel. The Ahr is the smallest region, which is actually primarily Pinot Noir, which is kind of interesting. To back up 1 second, the Ahr is primarily Pinot Noir, and Baden is primarily Pinot Noir. So you kind of have this like bookend of red, and then primarily white grape growing going on in the center of that, which is really interesting. So the monastic era developed a lot of these vineyards. They started to name not only the abbeys or the cloisters that they were building, but also the vineyards that were associated with them. They built the castles, which are known as Schloss in Germany, and the abbeys, which are known as cloisters. So you'll see those words a lot. Benedictine monks founded the cloister at Johannesburg, one of the most important producers of Riesling in the world, but also historically for Riesling. If you have been a fan of Riesling from around the world, that sort of predates the European system asking other countries to not use traditional terms on wines outside of those areas. Like, for example, don't use champagne on American wine, right? Don't use sherry on a fortified wine coming from Australia. Well, there was also commonly Riesling was called Johannesburg Riesling. So even producers like Chateau Montelena in Calistoga and places like Napa Valley, if you look at their Riesling coming from like the 70s, the 80s, and even into the 90s, they'll say Johannesburg Riesling on them as a reference to this Schloss Johannesburg, this abbey that was built and founded in the early 12th century. Cistercians arrived from Burgundy. They established Kloster Eberbach. They probably brought Pinot Noir with them, and this was probably one of the starts of cultivating Pinot Noir within Germany and within the Rheingau as well. And just like, and we'll see this as we move down the timeline here, but just as everywhere, the Cistercians especially were great farmers. They had a wonderful aptitude for both viticulture and agriculture. So they really built a lot of these sort of agriculture and viticultural holdings within some of these areas. During the same time, we start to see a lot of estates that are established by aristocrats. They secure incredibly massive holdings. Schloss Schönborn is one of those, Schloss Vollrad, Baron Langworth von Simmern, Schloss Reinhardtshausen, all have centuries of noble lineage. We'll talk about that. And they still populate the region. These families are still here. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition in the Rheingau that you do have these incredibly old established estates that produce wine, and then a lot of these kind of younger, like hip, cool producers as well. Not that the older guys aren't cool too, because they definitely are. They're still making delicious wine, but they coexist really peacefully. You know, this isn't the type of region where we have like the Barolo boys and the Barolo wars or things like that, right? We don't have the sort of the head-to-head butting of like the traditionalist and the modernist. They coexist very peacefully here. In 1435, we see the really the first record being written that indicate the cultivation of Riesling by Kloster Eberbach, and they're cultivating it all throughout the Rheingau during this time. The Schloss Johannesburg and Schloss Schönborn are among the first producers in all of Germany to introduce glass bottles. This happened as early as the 1700s. This was much earlier than a lot of really quality regions, even in France, even in places like Champagne and Bordeaux. So this is really interesting as well. Kloster Eberbach, we keep seeing this name, began marketing their high quality wines as something known as cabinet or cabinet, as we call it today. And essentially, and I want to expand on this just for 1 second, they were saying that the certain wines that they were producing were of high enough quality that they benefited from time spent in the cabinet, right? And so this is something that I want to expand on with the concept of Riesling. Is so often we drink Riesling so young, even though we know that it is a grape that has incredible ageability because of its structure, right? High acidity and sometimes some sugar. Those are both structural elements. Now, a lot of Riesling, when it doesn't, and keep this in mind because we're going to talk about the sort of new classification system, a lot of Riesling, when it doesn't necessarily list a vineyard or a region or a village on the label, is coming from areas that don't allow for the ripeness of complex flavors in the wine. So oftentimes you might just have really high acidity that's trying to be balanced by leaving natural sugar in the wine or even chaptalizing the wine, adding sugar at the fermentation to increase the richness later on, right? But it might not have the flavor development. And Riesling also really does, when it comes from high quality terroir, it develops a lot of flavor as it sits in the bottle. So this is really important, something to think about that was recognized as early as 1712. In 1775, Schloss Johannesburg announces the first planned Spätlese harvest of botrytis affected fruit. In 1786, the Archbishop of Trier, Clemens Wenceslaus, decrees a mandatory shift to Riesling. Now, this is taking place in the Mosel. We're not talking about the Rheingau in this specific case, but it's here because it really shows us that we're beginning to see that Riesling really is one of the noble grapes of Germany. And this is sort of the start of Riesling becoming Riesling in Germany, especially in the 1800s. In the late 1700s, Napoleon annexes all land west of the Rhine River. And as what happened within France as well, all of the church-owned vineyards are secularized. Napoleon Code fragments the vineyard holdings, and this leads to eventually some of the effects of the 1971 German wine law. And so when the vineyards were fragmented, they began to be passed down equally to all eligible heirs of the family, right? Or I said heirs of the family, and they were fractured, right? The vineyards themselves or the sections that were owned got smaller and smaller. Now, remember I said at the very beginning, in the Rheingau, this is also important, remember a lot of aristocracy, a lot of church holdings in the Rheingau. These vineyards were split, and so many Schlossberg, Roseneck, Bischofberg. These are all vineyards that have multiple owners that make wine from them. So you will see the same vineyard name on multiple producers' bottles of wine. In the 1800s, we begin to see a golden era for German Riesling. They really command top dollar. You can see some of these kind of wine lists from this time. We know that when the Titanic sank, the most expensive bottle of wine on the Titanic at that time was actually a bottle of German Riesling. It didn't come from the Rheingau, it came from the Rheinhessen. But even so, these were very high quality, sought after wines, very well regarded. In 1910, we see the formation of a group that we call today the VDP. So just keep this in mind. It was initially founded to focus on mature wines that were not having sugar added for the chaptalization. Now, A lot of us probably know some of these things, but I just want to cover it in case we're not familiar. I mentioned it already. Chaptalization is the practice of adding sugar to the juice during the fermentation. So this is not to increase the sugar level of the finished wine. This is actually to increase the alcohol level of the finished wine, because when you add it during fermentation, that excess sugar that you've added will also, along with the natural grape sugar, be converted into alcohol. So just let's make sure we cover that. In 1910, this group, sort of producers association that would become the VDP, recognized that this was not the path to the highest quality of wine. Now, why would we chaptalize? We're in a really cold climate, and sometimes you need it to bring a little bit more richness to the wine. But, unfortunately, sometimes the concept in the past of chaptalization became systemic as opposed to something that could be used in a colder vintage if you did need to bring a little more oomph to your wine, right? In 1900, we began to see the rise of crossing. So oftentimes a lot of vitis vinifera vine crossed with American grape varieties to create hybrids. This was really to combat cold. That's what it was for. It was too cold in Germany for a lot of the really noble grapes during this time. And so it really helped us increase the quantity of wine in Germany, especially after phylloxera, but it didn't increase the quality of wine during this time. Now, in 1971, we see the biggest shift in the German wine law. During this time, they seek to reorganize and condense the existing 30,000 vineyard sites that all had primarily different names into 2,600 sites. And it also codifies the sugar level of the grape at harvest as the quality hierarchy. We're going to expand on that. In the 1980s, Liebfraumilch is the biggest export. There's a lot of mass market confusion over German labeling and wine styles. Liebfraumilch, or the Blue Nun style, is primarily based on Müller-Thurgau. It's a hybrid grape that was created at Geisenheim. It's not Riesling, as many people think it must be because it comes from Germany. There's probably some Riesling blended in with the Müller-Thurgau, along with, maybe Weißburgunder or Grauburgunder, like Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, things like that. In 1984, the Carter Association, and this is important because it's specific to the Rheingau, is created. So it says Charta, it's pronounced Carter in German, and their role was to elevate dry Riesling to its prior historical role, right, prior to World War II. So this is very congruent to what the VDP is beginning to do during this time. So in the 1980s, the VDP was also rebranded, and they decided, we'll talk about this in a second, to really focus on trying to classify wines by site as opposed to sugar levels at harvest. Bernard Brewer in the village of Rudesheim really led the charge of the Carter Association. In 1999, Erstgewach, which means first growth, became permitted under German wine law. So in the Rheingau, it can be used on a bottle of either Riesling or Spätburgunder to indicate essentially a Grand Cru style of wine coming from this region. So about a third of the entire area falls into the Erstgewach category. It has a logo of 3 Roman arches. We'll see that in a moment. It's the balcony of the historic Grauhaus Hotel in Winkel down by the river. And this is what's used to indicate these first growth or Erstgewach bottlings coming from the Rheingau. So remember, the Carter Association is specific only to the Rheingau. And we're going to talk about the VDP in a moment, which had members in all of the 13 Weinbaugebiete that we do see within Germany. In the late 1900s, there was oftentimes, late 1990s, that should say 1990s, not 1900s. It would kind of assume, in the late 1900s that noble blood produced noble wine, but these historic estates seemed less inspired. By the 1990s, we're really seeing, again, some of the younger producers, Joseph Leitz, Eva Fricke, George Breuer, Kunstler, and Peter Jacob Kuhn, to be the ones to talk about that start to, again, bring some quality-minded grape growing and winemaking back to the Rheingau. in 2002, 2012, and now 2021, the VDP vineyard classifications have updated their tenets to better organize and codify German wine law. I know it's a lot, but I promise you're going to understand it in just a moment. So let's take a break from the history. Let's talk about the geography and the climate. Even though we have a pretty homogeneous south-facing slope with a pretty similar climate, we really do have a lot of different soil types. So the soil is, so this is the antithesis of the Mosel, right? Where because of this snaking, winding river, you have all of these different aspects and these different microclimates within these different twists and turns on the river, but you have a pretty homogeneous soil type overall in the Mosel. Rheingau is the opposite, homogeneous climate and more or less homogeneous aspect. You can be higher and lower on the hill, but very, very different soil types, right? So on the upper slopes, you have a higher proportion of slate. They tend to be stony. They have more eroded soils. These will generally produce more crystalline, sometimes higher acid, a little bit, sometimes, I mean, you might even say like crunchier wines, right? They're going to be more linear, more taut on the palate. On the lower slopes, you have more clay, less alluvial sand, and red slate. As you're moving closer to the river, these will just create a palette of Riesling that tends to be a little bit more bold, slightly more rich and round than something that you might get from some of the higher slopes. If we're talking about somewhere like the village of Rudesheim, where you still have a lot of different soil types, even within one village, you have 4 different vineyards that you find within Rudesheim here. In Rotland, you see a lot of gray slate. In Schlossberg, you have a lot of red slate. This can sometimes put some hydric stress on the vines, increasing the intensity and the concentration of these grapes when they have smaller berries and lower yields. You see more loam and quartzite in Bischofberg, and quartz and quartzite in Roseneck. Roseneck is probably my favorite Rudesheim vineyard. The wines tend to be really floral and aromatic, but in a really delicate way. They're really quite pretty. So we're talking primarily about Riesling. Pinot Noir is the other major grape that they grow here. We do quite a bit of Pinot Noir, which we'll talk about, but you'll also see Weißburgunder and Grauburgunder are not uncommon, which are Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris, the Burgundian grape varieties, just like Pinot Noir. Where do you think they came from? Probably with those Cistercian and Benedictine monks, right? So some people do believe that Riesling first sprung from a seed within the Rheingau, and this is the most committed region, the Rheingau, to Riesling in all of Germany. It really is. So it is very, very small, as we mentioned. There's barely over 3,000 hectares within the Rheingau, but 2,500 of those hectares are Riesling. So nearly 8 out of every 10 vines. Riesling is also the latest picked grape within the Rheingau as well. So you'll be picking your Pinot Blanc, your Pinot Gris, and your Pinot Noir long before you'll be picking your Riesling, especially if you're looking for some of those riper styles. Near the river and even closer to the villages is where you tend to get a little bit more of the botrytis character of your wine. I wouldn't say necessarily that botrytis styles of Riesling are kind of the calling card of the Rheingau, but they do exist, and there are producers that do prefer to use a little bit of that, as opposed to producers who don't like any botrytis flavor within their wine. What does botrytis do? It adds sometimes some marmalade, right? Some ginger, really piquant, honeyed flavor to your wine. Very common to find that botrytis character within the Mosel. Do you find a little bit of it within the Rheingau as well? We see in a really extended hang time for these wines that you do find necessary for the Prodicats. We'll talk about in a second. And most of the vintages, like nearly in most vintages, nearly 40% of production does go to the Prodicats vine, even if a lot of those wines finish dry. 80% of Rheingau Riesling is Trocken in style. It is dry. It had less than 9 grams per liter of residual sugar, that natural grape sugar that is left over in the grape from the fermentation. We're not adding any sugar to make the wine sweet. And even at 9 grams per liter or less of that natural sugar in the wine, the wines still feel very dry because the acidity is so high. In the Rheingau, it's not uncommon for these dry wines to have 1 and 1 of total acidity and residual sugar. So meaning if there were 9 grams per liter of residual sugar in this Riesling at finish, there would be 9 grams of total acidity as well. In fact, to call a wine Trocken, the total acidity has to be within 2 grams of the total residual sugar. If you guys have questions about these things, I know it's a lot. You can ask me later. Even if you watch the recording and you're like, Amber, what are you talking about? Total acidity and residual sugar. These are important terms for German wines and for understanding Riesling and their effect on our palate. So feel free to reach out to me if you do have any questions. Overall, the style of Rheingau wines are more powerful, they're more concentrated than these more delicate style that you do find within the Mosel. The Mosel is like kind of more racy and lacy and filigreed, right? Rheingau's a little bolder in style. So you keep hearing this term, the Predikat system. So what does this mean? So in 1971, we decided to classify the wines of Germany much differently than we did in any other of the major wine growing regions in Europe. So the first level, so essentially we have, we have your Landwein, you have your Deutscher Wein, which is just wine from anywhere in Germany. It can come from blended from any of the 13 Anbaugebiete. Remember, we saw the Anbaugebiete, all those colored areas on the map earlier, the 13 of them. So essentially, it's not on this list, but your Deutscher wine can come from anywhere. It can be a blend of any grape from anywhere, very, very low levels of sorry, I lost the thought of my words, like the very, there's no limits on what you can make. That's what I'm trying to say. There's not really a lot of limits on what you can make at the Deutscher wine level. It's just wine from Germany. It can pretty much be any grape, and it can pretty much be made in any style, and it can come from anywhere. So these are not majority of the types of wines that we get into the US, right? Usually the wines that we get are at the Qualitätswein or the Predikat level. So Qualitätswein means that all of the grape will come from a single one of the 13 Anbaugebiete, and you'll see that Anbaugebiete listed on the label. For our purposes, we'll talk about the Rheingau. That's where we are today. Rheingau is one of the 13 Anbaugebiete. You can include terms like Trocken, which means dry. You can include terms like Halbtrocken, which means off dry, or Feinherb, which means off dry. There is not a difference necessarily in the style of the wine if you're using Halbtrocken or Trocken, but Trocken, as we mentioned before, means you have to have less than 9 grams per liter of that natural leftover grape sugar in your wine. Halbtrocken has to be 18 grams per liter or less of that natural sugar in your wine. And Feinherb, although it is a term that you can legally use within Germany, has no laws. So you can call it an off-dry wine, but it could have a higher level than just 18 grams per liter if you wanted. So if you like wine that's a little bit off-dry, but still kind of finishing on the dry side, you probably like the Halbtrocken. Feinherb could have a higher level of sugar to it. Now, the Predikat essentially is considered to be used to classify the level of sweetness in the wine, but this is not the original intention of the classification system. Now, this is the quality system that we do use, however, up until what we're going to start talking about in a second. So we classify the ripeness of the grapes when they're actually picked at harvest. Now, the Cabernet style should be the least ripe. And then the sort of Auslese, Trocken Auslese, and Eiswein should be the ripest. Now, we oftentimes correlate these Predikat levels with the level of sweetness in the wine. Now, it can also tell us a little bit about what we can expect, but it's not really meant to be about the sweetness, because any of these first 3 wines can be fermented to total dryness. So let me try to clarify that a little bit more. So Cabernet should be picked from ripe grapes that still have a fresh character to them. Now, Spätlese, these are the ones we keep in the cabinet, right? Spätlese, these are wines that should be a little bit, or grapes, excuse me, that should be a little bit overripe when they're picked, and they show riper, intenser, more concentrated fruit flavors than we get in the cabinet. The Auslese wines, or grapes, excuse me, should start to shrivel on the vine when we pick them. In a way, they're starting to be slightly raisinated. And at this level, you might possibly be beginning to see the effect of botrytis at your Auslese wine. So you might begin to see the effect of that. We mentioned before, that kind of like honey, sometimes high toned, like golden raisin character that you might get into the wine, a little bit of marmalade and ginger. Auslese and Trocken Auslese will always be sweet because these are made from grapes that are affected by botrytis, and they're taking the water out of the grape and they're concentrating all of that sugar and all of that flavor. And then ice vine, now let me go back one step, because Trocken Auslese is sometimes confusing because you're like, but wait a minute, you just said Trocken is dry, I mean dry in German, and now you're telling me that Trocken Auslese wines are always sweet. The difference here is that Trocken in this term refers to the fact that the grape is dried out. So we'll take a look at that. So even though you do see Trocken, that's a reference to the grape and not necessarily to the dryness of the wine. And then ice vine should not have botrytis. These should be healthy grapes that are late harvest, that have frozen on the vine. So they should have a really crystalline expression of Riesling or of grape variety to them without the additional flavors that you get from botrytis. This is more and more rare with global warming because it just simply doesn't get cold early enough to freeze those grapes on the vine at the ripeness level that they need. So you can see in the photo here, so these are going to be cabinet or Spätlese level grapes. So they're ripe or slightly overripe, but they're not raisined or affected by botrytis, that noble mold yet. Auslese, you see a mix of these grapes, right? Some are slightly shriveled, some are still fresh. Auslese, a lot of effect of that botrytis, that noble rot, that's really concentrating the sugar in the grape, that's drying it out. And then the Trocken Auslese. These ones are completely botrytis affected. They have very, very low water content in the grape. So the sugars are very, very concentrated. The resulting wine will be very, very sweet and luscious, very much a dessert style wine. They can range if you're making a cabinet style wine, probably going to be in the pale straw color. If you're making a Auslese or Trocken Auslese, it's probably going to be a much deeper yellow. The wines will also deepen in color as they age as well, and the wines do oxidize within the bottle. This is a lot, guys. I'm sorry. I'm like trying to keep it light and easy, but there's just so much to talk about with the German wines and the Rheingau. So let's just briefly talk about the VDP system, the growers organization that we know, the high quality wines to focus on vineyard site and the notion of terroir. Now, there's over 200 members. They exist in all 13 Weinbaugebiete, but the VDP is not technically approved by German wine law. It is technically a growers association. So they classify their wines by where they come from. And I'm going to come back to this in a second because I think it's important to talk about why the wine laws in 2021, which are going to go fully into effect, it's going to be mandatory for all German wines by 2026, why this exists. So this is kind of a collaboration of the history and the wine law that we've talked about, right? So we understand that most countries classify their wines according to the source of the grapes, right? That's not how Germany does it. It classifies its wines according to the ripeness of the grapes at harvest. So not necessarily based on the vineyard site. So the historic system in Germany, which was defined by the wine laws of 1930 and 1971, used that sugar level at harvest as the criterion for classification. Now, recently, with the trend of global warming, we see a more recent focus on the Trocken or dry wine. So this is partly because of global warming and also partly just because of the fashion of the day. People don't want to drink sweet wines. They want to drink dry wines. The Prodicot wines, because of this, are no longer as important as they used to be. But understanding the Prodicot system, which is still in place and is still a classification of German wine, can be useful for understanding the history of wine production in Germany and the view that we've had in the past that in this very, very cold climate, reaching ripeness was once the all-important factor. Now, if we again compare Germany to other wine-producing regions of the world, when we think about, or in Europe, let's compare it with Europe, if you think about the Grand Crus of Alsace, the Grand Cru villages and Premier Cru villages of Champagne, the Premier Crus and Grand Crus of Burgundy. Historically, these vineyards sites were probably classified as the best because they were where you could achieve ripeness the most every year. You could consecutively achieve ripeness every year, right? So really, the only difference here in the German wine law is that they're using the actual grapes as that model instead of the vineyard sites that are growing the grapes that are getting this ripe. So there's a great contrast, right? That the Prodicot system is in contrast with the other European countries where only specified vineyards can produce these quality and classified styles of wine. So in Germany, for the past 50 years, the system of this geographical classification had been based on the rationalization of the classification of grapes from the wine law of 1971. So the system where we do list in Germany before what the VDP created, anything like a region or a vineyard or a village on a bottle of wine would indicate the source without an actual implication of quality, because none of the names of these vineyards, these villages, or these sites were actually ranked. The quality was only defined by the Prodicot system. So we understand that, right? We just went through that Prodicot system. So in 2021, we're seeing additional wine law that follows the VDP system of classification. So I wanted to go to this first. Now that VDP system of classification is similar to the model that we see somewhere like Burgundy, where at the kind of bottom of the tier, we have a regional wine. So this would be like your Bourgogne Rouge or your Bourgogne Blanc. The grape can come from anywhere within the larger Rheingau area. This is your Gutwein. One step up in quality would be a village level wine, what we know as the Ortswein. So this would be, for example, a single village like Rudesheim. A step up from that, we have essentially your Premier Cru wine. These are known as Erstlage. These are known as your Erstlage wine. They were the highest quality until 2012 when we introduced the Grosslage. So Grosslage are your Grand Cru wines, the highest vineyard designation. It should mimic the Grand Cru of Burgundy, but unfortunately, there are far, far more Grosslage sites than there are Grand Cru vineyards in Burgundy. So the system is still a little bit unwieldy and convoluted. There's just no way to learn really every single Grosslage site that there might be within Germany, because we're talking about all of Germany as a country and not just a single region like Burgundy in France. Oftentimes, you also see the Grossgewach or Grossgewach, great growth. Now, these are a subset of the Grosslage, meaning that these are wines that come from the Grand Cru vineyards within one of these regions in Germany, but they're always made as a dry style. Any of these wines, Gutwein, Ortswein, Erstlage, Grosslage, can also follow the Prodicot system, meaning you could have conjunctive labeling with Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, etc., and one of these sites. Grossgewach wine can only come from a Grosslage site, and the ripeness of the grapes at harvest is always at the Spätlese level of ripeness when the grapes are picked, but they're always fermented to a completely dry style. So keep in mind too that oftentimes we think of these three getting increasingly sweeter, Cabernet, Spätlese, Auslese, but Spätlese and Auslese can be vinified or fermented to complete dryness. One of the other confusing things about the system is that you can declassify your wine. So you could pick your grapes at Auslese level of ripeness, but then say, oh, I had so much, the vintage conditions just gave me so much Auslese, but I need some Spätlese to sell to the market because that's what they're expecting. So you can declassify your Auslese wine to Spätlese, which further convolutes the entire system. I don't know if I'm making anything easier for you, because it is a really not silly. I mean, there's a lot of great things about the German system, but as I'm going through it now and trying to explain it, I'm just like, it's so convoluted. It's so subject to change, and we're constantly trying to update and upgrade and make it easier for the consumer, and attempting to simplify the language that we see on the label. But I'm not sure if that's what's really happening yet. So today you will see this system of labeling by, again, region, village, Premier Cru, Grand Cru. You will see it in parallel or in conjunction with the predicate system for quality. So the quality system won't only be about the ripeness of grapes at harvest, but should also be based on a designation of geography and the quality of the site as well. And I'm going to send out all of these things too, so you have your own copy that you can go through. So you can kind of see a little bit of the quality pyramid here. Deutscher Wein, grape from anywhere. Landwein, these are larger regions within Germany. They're not one of the 13 Weinbaugebiete. They cover larger areas. Qualitätswein, again, has to come from one of the 13 named Weinbaugebiete. It can only come from a single one. You can't have some from the Rheingau and some from the Pfalz and call it Qualitätswein, right? That would just be Deutscher Wein. Within the Qualitätswein system, you have the predicate, labeling your grapes by the level of ripeness at harvest. And then you can also label it with your vine growing area. So region, like the Rheingau, village, like Rudesheim, vineyard, like Schlossberg, that would be your single vineyard. And then you could have a Premier Cru or Grand Cru. And you can also label it with a individual Lieu-dit, known today as a Gavon. So since this just took effect, you might not necessarily be seeing a lot of these until 2026, when it is mandatory for every estate. So how can we read some of these labels, right? So here, the way that we're labeling them currently, Ausmannhausen, Hollenberg. So they're telling you that the village is Ausmannhausen, Hollenberg is the vineyard, the region is the Rheingau. This is a GG wine. So this is a Großgewach wine. Essentially, that is the VDP way of telling you that this is a dry style of wine from a Grand Cru vineyard. If it says GG, Großgewach, it can only be dry, but it will be ripe and powerful. This is coming from Künstler. They're located in Hochheim. We'll talk about that. JB Becker, this is one of the wines we're drinking tonight. Wallufer Walkenberg, the village of Wallufer, essentially in German means of. So 2009 of 2009 vintage of the village of Wallufer. The vineyard itself is Walkenberg. They Spätlese level of ripeness. Now, the wine that we had tonight, and which showed you on the previous slide, was Spätlese Trocken. So the Spätlese Trocken is telling you the grapes were picked at Spätlese level of ripeness, but it was fermented to total dryness. This one does not say that. So you might assume that there might be a little bit of natural sugar to the wine, or you can take a peek at the alcohol, right? This looks to me like it says 12%, which is pretty high for a white wine and for a German Riesling. So you can assume that if the alcohol is high, that most of the sugar in that wine when it was fermenting went into alcohol, meaning it's probably not that sweet, right? If you looked at that alcohol level and it said something like 7.5%, 8% ABV, alcohol by volume, that's telling you not all of the sugar stayed in the wine, right? It wasn't fermented into alcohol. So you know at 8%, 9%, you're going to have a sweeter style of Riesling than you are at 11, 12, or 13%. And most Riesling will sit around in Germany, like in the Rheingau, around 12% specifically. Other regions will be a little bit different depending on their climates, where they are. But in the Rheingau, it's traditionally going to be usually around 12%, give or take a little bit. You can see another example of labeling, Fritz Hag, Riesling Trocken. No other indication of where this wine comes from. This is a really high quality producer, but this is just an entry level wine that they're introducing to you. And in this case, the comes from the region of the Rheingau, the Weinbaugebiete. It is a Riesling Trocken, so it's a dry style, but there's no other indication of where the grapes come from. So the grapes in this bottle could come from any vineyard within the Rheingau and be blended together. These are the traditional barrel size of the Rheingau, a 1200 liter Stück, as they're called as well. So let's take a quick look at the map here. I'm keeping you guys all night, so we still have some regions to talk about. Like I said, I know some of you have to jump off because I thought I was actually going to get through that history and understanding German wine law a little bit quicker. But, unfortunately, sometimes that's just how it happens. I look at the clock and I realize we've been talking about German wine law for an hour. But I hope that we understand it. So let's take just a look at the Rheingau. You can see this bend in the river at Mainz and Wiesbaden, where we begin to flow west, all the way over to Ausleses, where it begins to flow to the north again. So this is really kind of the edge of Wallufer and Eltville, of the kind of eastern side of the Rheingau, except for this small part of Hochheim, where Künstler is located over here on the other side of Wiesbaden. The western main portion ends at Ausleses, but then you do have a little spot in Lorch here as well, where we do find like Eva Fricke making some really fantastic wines over there, although there's not a lot of vineyard land there as well. Here you can see sort of a Google Maps image that we find from our friend Fernando Beteta, the master sommelier, who makes some really fantastic wines like this. You see the Rhine River, you see the Taunus mountain range and the forests that top the mountain range here. And then the vineyards, essentially, just like in Burgundy or Alsace, they sit, the villages sit along the river primarily, and then the vineyards rise up the hill behind it. So Schlossberg, Hohenberg and Ausleses, this is Schloss Johannesburg, Kloster Eberbach, Grafenberg, Robert Weil makes really fantastic wine from here. Sonnenberg and Eltville, Hockheimer Holla means like hill of stones, although the direct translation is hell, but the translation for the reason that it's called Holla is because it's called hill of stones in this region. Künstler makes some great wine from there. And in Winkel, we have Jesuit in Garten as well, makes really great wine. So let's talk about a few of these individual villages, right? We're not going to have like a, so much to say about all of these because, like I said, we kind of do have a like homogeneous climate. So they're not as crazy different from each other as we see in somewhere like perhaps like Burgundy. Also, it's hard to really, we can talk about the differences in these villages, but as long as we can have a classification system that allows for such a huge range of ripeness and of styles in terms of sweetness in the wines themselves, it's a little harder to pinpoint the terroir, right? It's not like France and Burgundy where you're making dry styles of two grapes. Here we're making, well, primarily one grape, but in a huge range of different styles as well. So in Ausleses, this is where we find the majority of the Rheingau's Spätburgunder. Spätburgunder means late ripening Burgundy. It's very, very clever with their naming here. So Pinot Noir came from Burgundy, as we know, it's late ripening. If you remember those regions we looked at before, Sachsen and Saale Unstrut, they have an early ripening Pinot Noir called Frühburgunder. What does Früh mean? It means early. So Frühburgunder is early Burgundy, Spätburgunder is late Burgundy. It is the Rheingau's most planted red grape. The Hohenberg vineyard that we looked at in the previous slide, you can see it here in Ausleses. It's the most well-known vineyard in this area. August Kessler is the #1 producer that you really hear about in terms of quality wines, really coming from the village of Ausleses. But you might also see Hessit's Stadtweinguter in Ausleses as well. Rudesheim, as we're moving towards the east. Rudesheim is one of the most important villages within the Rheingau. If you're going to stay here for a vacation, I would suggest Rudesheim. I think it has the highest number of hotels, probably the highest number of restaurants. Aside from going to like the bigger city like Wiesbaden or Mainz, I think Rudesheim has a lot of that like small, really beautiful village feel to it. It has 3 really fantastic vineyards. They are the steepest in the Rheingau. Berg Schlossberg, we talked about that red slate and clay in this region, if you remember that. Sorry, not clay, that red slate. We have Berg Roseneck, has more of that quartzite, really kind of delicate, floral, pretty styles of wine. Berg Rotland with a little bit more of that gray slate. The wines tend to be a little more mineral and umami as well. As we move further east, we have Geisenheim and then Johannesburg. Johannesburg is its own village with the Schloss Johannesburg, the Castle Johannesburg, and located within it, but it's really usually considered part of Geisenheim. Now, Geisenheim is incredibly important because the Geisenheim Wine Institute is here, where both Hayo Becker and Eva Fricke studied that we talked about, as well as many other German wine producers and German and just wine producers from all over the world. In fact, when I worked at Harvest at Brooks Wines in the Willamette Valley in 2017, one of my other Harvest interns was an Italian who at the time that I met him was working for a really famous producer in Northern Italy, who I'm forgetting, Foradori, working for Elisabetta Foradori, who was a winemaker there. And we found out at Harvest in Oregon that we had actually worked as neighbors in 2014 in the village of Rudesheim, because he was going to the Geisenheim Wine Institute and he was working Harvest for George Breuer, who we're going to talk about as well. But it really is a top enological school. They also do a lot of grape breeding and experiments here as well. Now, the region is really dominated by Schloss Johannesburg. This is looking west from the eastern side of the village of Rudesheim. So when I say it's one of the larger villages, you're probably like, there's no way, but it literally is. As we move further east, we come to Winkel. Schloss Vollrad is an incredibly historic 800-year-old Ort style. We haven't used the term Ort style yet, but an Ort style is a named area that's so famous that you don't necessarily have to use the village name with it. Other important vineyards in the area are Jesuitgarten and Hasensprung. We move into Hattenheim as well. Pfaffenberg is a monopole of Schloss Schönborn, meaning they're the only producer, which is unusual in the Rheingau, that make wine from this particular vineyard. Manberg is almost a monopole of von Simmern, but there are a few other producers. Steinberg is here, planted in the 12th century. We move into Hallgarten, higher elevation, further up on the slope. There's only a few, there are vineyards that are higher on the slope, but there are very few villages that are higher up on the slope. Most of them are located down on the river themselves, but it does have more marl soils. Schönhell and Jungfer will also find. The monastery Kloster Eberbach is here. It's been used for a number of different reasons. Since it was initially a monastery, it was used as an insane asylum and a women's prison, but today it is a functional winery and museum again. They make quite a bit of wine within the area as well, or within like the Kloster Eberbach. So you can see the monastery, a few pictures here, the beautiful, beautiful place. And I mentioned before, but you can genuinely just spend an entire day just walking through the vineyard of the Rheingau. It's incredibly beautiful. The view is fantastic. We find Marco Brunn in Urbach, the lower lying contiguous vineyard to Manmerg, which is just lies a little bit to the east. It has really high quality and warm vintages. Higher up on the hill is the village of Kiedrich. They're really famous for Robert Weil. We looked at one of those bottles a few slides ago. They make really fantastic sweet wine from a vineyard called Grafenberg. And they're one of the best, most well-known producers to make wine out of this area. In Eltvilla, this is where we find the tasting room of Eva Fricke. She used to be up in Kiedrich, but she moved her tasting room down to Eltvilla. It's a beautiful riverside village. I would also suggest, I think Rudesheim is the best place to stay in the Rheingau, but if you want to stay a little bit closer to the bigger city, Eltvilla is a really beautiful town as well. They do some great, especially during the summer, a lot of wine fairs and fun riverside events like that as well. And then Hochheim, we talked about as well. Hochheim is located on the other side of Wiesbaden. So Wiesbaden really is a pretty large city by comparison to all of these smaller villages that you find within the Rheingau. So it really is a little bit of an anomaly that it's separated from the rest of the Rheingau, even though it is considered administratively part of that area. It's not part of that same major slope, but it's a little bit of a continuation of it on the other side of Wiesbaden. This is the origin of the British term for Riesling, which we know as Hock. They would pronounce Hochheim as Hochheim. It's a gentler slope. It does tend to be much warmer. We have Holla, which we mentioned before, Hill of Stones, and Kirchenstück is a top vineyard as well. Ausmannhausen produces on the western side a lot of Pinot Noir that we know, remember, August Kessler, but Künstler on the far eastern side also produces quite a bit of Pinot Noir coming from the village of Hochheim. So it's also a really fantastic place to look for if you're curious about some Pinot Noir. And some really great maps that kind of break down some of the vineyards that you'll see, but I know we're way over on time, so we're not going to spend too much time going through that. I'll send the slides out tomorrow, and you're welcome to kind of look over some of these maps yourself. I'll just send a copy of the slides, but I'll also kind of break it down into a more like digestible outline. So if you want to look at the VDP and the Predicats and the Qualitätswein and the new upcoming wine laws, you'll be able to do that as well. A couple of estates I think it's really important to focus on. So the first would be George Breuer. Breuer is, I think this is spelled wrong. It should have an E in there. Breuer is one of the really quality-minded estates. Bernard Breuer was really instrumental in the formation of the Carter Producers Association in 1984 that really wanted to bring a focus back to dry styles of Riesling coming from the Rheingau specifically. Was established in 1880 by Peter Breuer. George ran the estate until 1978. And now Bernard's daughter, Teresa, runs the estate. So she is the head winemaker. She takes care of a lot of the vineyards. She had, last time I was there, really great assistant winemaker working for her. His name was Marcus. And he was actually from Sweden, which is really cool to see some of our more Northern European coming down and making wine within this region with Teresa. They own land in many of the best vineyards within Rudesheim. So they're located in Rudesheim. This is where my friend Luca was working when we found out I was working for Carl Erhard and he was working for George Breuer when we met in Oregon same year. So we probably met each other here because the winery I worked for had a wine bar, so everybody else in the village would come to the wine bar after their day of picking grapes. So I'm sure that we met, but kind of a fun story about the wine world. They own spots in Roseneck, Rotland, Nonnenberg, which is a monopole, Valenthaler Nonnenberg as well. They make Trocken, Auslese, and Auslese Gold Capsule. When you see a gold capsule on a bottle of wine, usually it's an indication for Auslese or Spätlese that it is an even more luscious and sweet style. So again, not necessarily codified into the law, but one of those tricks that you can learn about what producers do in Germany to try to give the consumer a little bit more information about what they can expect within that bottle. So if you have a gold capsule or even what's called a long gold capsule, so it's even longer, indicating more ripeness, more richness, and more botrytis than even just the gold capsule. They are organic, no herbicide. They do hand harvesting. They don't like any of the botrytis on their dry wine. So their non-Prodicat, just their entry-level wines, will not have botrytis on them. But they left the VDP and the Carta in 1999. So they are not necessarily trying to use either of these producer association with any of their wines as well. A couple of their labels here. Schloss Johannesburg, the Johannesburg Castle. This is the one that really began to introduce the concept of purposefully making late harvest styles of wine, like Spätlese and Auslese in the late 1700s. It was established by Benedictine monks more than 900 years ago. It's high up on the hillside behind Geisenheim. It's a beautiful walk to the property, and the property is absolutely gorgeous. They have great restaurant, rooms for tasting. You can walk around the grounds. They have a wonderful rose garden. It's a really fantastic place to visit if you do go to this region as well. They make all Riesling. They have 35 hectares. They do have a monopole, also known as the Schloss Johannesburg, and they tend to show the differentiate between their wine with the labels that you'll see. So all of the different colors of seal indicate a different style of wine that they are making as well. And they have a lot of barrels that they actually build from wood and oak that's grown on the property. So this is looking up the hillside at Schloss Johannesburg. This is the building in the winery itself, the castle, and then you can just see an aerial view. So you would have, this is, I believe this is Geisenheim. No, this must be Geisenheim down closer to the river. And then you have Schloss Johannesburg up here. Robert Weil, located in Kiedrich, so another village closer to the eastern side, higher up on the slopes, established in 1875. We see a trend here, right? Very high acclaim, high prices for these wines. They were a favorite of Queen Victoria, Tsar Nicholas II, the Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These wines were quite important. Managed today by Willem Weil, the great grandson of Robert. And he's really credited for bringing a lot of the quality back to the higher level sweet wines coming from the vineyard like Grafenberg. They're also making wine from Klosterberg and Turmberg in the area as well. Also really beautiful, small, but really beautiful tasting room. So Kiedrich is up here higher on the slope, and then Grafenberg just sits just around the village itself here as well. More fun German pictures. Schloss Schönborn, established in 1349. They're also a founding member of the VDP in 1910. It's one of the oldest and largest privately owned wineries in Germany. They also have a really fantastic library of back vintage wines. So if you want to have the opportunity to try some of these older wines, Riesling gives you a fantastic opportunity for that because the wines age so well, and they're usually not expensive for aged wines. I mean, if you want to find a bottle of 1990 Bordeaux, I mean, I think you're going to spend, you know, $300, $400, $500 at the very, very minimum. You can get bottles of 1990 Riesling for like $40 or $50, and they're delicious. They can be absolutely fantastic if the provenance was really good as well. In fact, Schloss Schönborn actually claims that they have the oldest drinkable bottle of Rheingau Riesling, which is a 1735 Johannesburger, sold in 1987 for $29.5 thousand. It was tasted and then recorked. So allegedly, they said that the wine was drinkable, although I guess they didn't want to drink their investment. So they have vineyard holdings in Schlossberg, Marco Brunn, Pfaffenberg, and Dom de Chany, I think it's pronounced. Sometimes my German escapes me. Künstler we talked about. Again, this is a Grope Gewach bottling. So let's just go over the label again. Künstler is the producer. This is a GG wine, so a dry wine coming from a great growth, right? Or a Grand Cru vineyard. The vineyard is Holla in the village of Hochheim. And the region is the Rheingau, and it is a VDP wine. But you have to be a VDP wine in order to use the Gross Gewach. And I don't want to go too far back because I want to let you guys go, but probably didn't mention it. So this is the Traubenadler. The Traubenadler is the label that you're going to see on your VDP style of wine. So this is the official logo of the VDP, the Traubenadler, which is the eagle grasping the bunch of grapes. So you'll see that on usually the capsule or the foil that covers the cork of all of the VDP style of wine. These are the last three we're going to talk about. Eva Fricke, one of the producers that we talked about today, based out of Kiedrich. She was really inspired by her grandmother to travel the world, and she was bitten by the wine bug when she was working in South Africa. She studied at Geisenheim University. She apprenticed at Pingus. She was in Bordeaux, Australia, Italy, J.B. Becker, and Johannes Leitz in the Rheingau as well. Her first vintage was from a rented vineyard in Lorch. She borrowed her neighbor Teresa Breuer's of George Breuer's wine press. So you can see that the community in the Rheingau is very friendly. They're really are of the mindset, and they know that, you know, kind of we lift the reputation of one estate in the Rheingau, and we help our neighbors elevate their reputation. It elevates the reputation of all of the producers. And I'll probably send out a fuller list of wine producers too tomorrow, because I could keep you here all night, but I won't do that. She left Lights to focus on her label full time. And I've heard it here. It said that Lights had to hire 2 men to replace her. I've heard people said they had to hire up to 7 men to replace her, although I don't know if that's correct. Lights is that winery that she was working for prior to starting her own Eva Fricke eponymous winery. Lights goes back to 1744. The estate was started in 1947 in the area. Johannes is the winemaker now, taking over in 1985. He's really expanded the holdings and the quality of the estate as well. I would like to say, he produced a second label that's a little bit avant-garde called Lights Out, to make sure that people would know how to pronounce the name Lights correctly. So just remember, you see this one, think Lights Out, it's pronounced Lights. And then Carl Erhard, this is the producer that I worked for in 2014. We have a great relationship with him at Cork Buzz. We carry one of his wines by the glass at Chelsea Market right now. He and his wife Petra became the 5th generation in 1988. They have 3 children, and they age all of their Rieslings in the large Slovenian oak Fudra, and they're each named for his 3 daughters, Hannah, Marta, and Katarina. They only produce about 1,000 cases, so really, really low production. They've also always been organic since the start, and they only own about 10 hectares of these vineyards. They also own vineyard land in some of the most important sites in Rudesheim. Bischofsberg, Schlossberg, Roseneck, and Rotland are all really important, also in Kirchenstück as well. And he previously worked for Studied at Geisenheim as well, and worked for an important producer in Burgundy known as Jacques Prieur as well. So you might recognize that name. Jacques Prieur has quite a bit of vineyard land within Burgundy too. A couple of pictures, that's Carl and Petra. Here we have another picture of Eva Fricke, and here we have Johannes Lights. I think he's standing at, there's a memorial to Germany that you can hike up to at the very top of the hill, and I think he's standing up at this memorial, because that looks like that view from up there. And this is definitely above the village of Rudesheim here. All right, thank you. Any questions? Sorry, I kept you 22 minutes over, and I apologize. There was a lot to go through, and I really tried to make the classification as easy to understand as I could, but I know that it is a convoluted subject. So if you have any questions about that, please don't hesitate to let me know, because I know that can be confusing. But I really hope you enjoy your evening. I'll send out some follow-up materials. I'll probably send you an expanded producer list, but maybe that won't be tomorrow. I might need a little bit of time to work on that. But thank you so much. Enjoy your night, everyone. Please drink wine coming from the Rheingau. They're some of the best in Germany. All right, we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Good night.